Okay, we'll crack straight into it. What new
Sure, yeah.
what new information do we have about the Dublin Monaghan bombing that you've recently brought to light?
Right. There's new information from a now long deceased loyalist terrorist called Charlie Simpson, who was an extremely close friend of Robin the Jackal Jackson, and he learned an awful lot about Jackson's career, and Jackson told him an awful lot about the Dublin bombings, and this confirms research that's been carried out by others for decades, people like Joe Tiernan, Don Mullen, people like that. But this is yet another layer of confirmation, but it's coming from one of the best friends of Robin Jackson, and I think that's its importance. And what he said in a statement was as follows. I may as well just read it now. It's up on the story I've done recently. He was explaining to his friend Jackson was explaining to his friend Simpson the following, and he said that the UVF in Belfast had been provided with pre-made explosive devices, and scout cars were used to get the cars with the Dublin Monaghan bombings on board safely delivered. The British did not organise the bombing, but they supplied the equipment. Jackson, that's the jackal, mentioned people at Mahon Road Army Base in Portadown. He used the nicknames of these people. So that's confirmation that the Dublin bombings were carried out with the puppet masters pulling the strings in the background being British military intelligence and the wider British intelligence community in Northern Ireland at the time.
Okay, so where does this information come from, given he's deceased?
He gave a very lengthy statement to Chris Moore, the journalist of the BBC, who's a friend of mine, and Chris is doing a book on Kincora, and he was doing research and has been doing research for decades into Kincora. Simpson was a member of Tara. That's the terrorist organization that was led by William McGrath, the housefather at Kincora. He gave an extensive interview about Tara and other related matters, and there were a few comments in the Dublin bombings. Chris knew I was interested in it, and Chris gave them to me. That's the provenance of it.
Interesting. On the note,
Yeah, it's a 4-page document. I'd say in the story I've just put up on the Covert History website, I'd say I actually quote 2/3, if not 3/4 of it. So all pretty much all the new stuff is out there.
okay, so what we're going to discuss and much more is, of course, in this recent ebook that you published, and we'll put a link to it in the podcast and the YouTube, yeah, for anyone to read it. Okay, yeah. If anyone if anyone does have any sort of doubts as to whether the British intelligence service would be low enough and devious enough to do something like to be involved in Dublin Monaghan bombing, all you need to do is look at the evidence about Kincora, because I think if you're willing to let mass pedophilia go on, then I don't see what could be lower than that in terms of what you're willing to
Yeah, and these are the same people in the same locality at the same time. So, but another way of looking at it is a book, an official book with the full cooperation of MI6 was published about 10 years ago. And in that, they acknowledged that they were blowing up, MI6 were blowing up ships carrying Holocaust survivors away from Europe to Palestine at the time. Imagine you survive Auschwitz or something, and you're trying to get away, and these guys were coming around and blowing up the boats. No, most of the boats were blown up in the harbors. There's a rumor that maybe one of them was blown up at sea, but I don't pay an awful lot of credence to that. I don't think anyone's ever proven it, and I think it's such a big thing that it would have been proven by now. But the British Secret Service gave their files to a professor from Queen's University who produced this in a book. So if you're capable of blowing up ships that are going to carry Belsen, Treblinka, Auschwitz survivors, you're capable of doing anything. And I think that's part of the problem in Ireland, was that you had people who were blooded during the Second World War, which was a vicious fight. Now, the enemy were the Nazis, so I don't get carried away in criticizing them, but nonetheless, they were blooded. An awful lot of these guys then stayed in the British Army. I'm talking about the covert people, the intelligence people, the counterinsurgency people, and then they were further blooded and were continually blooding new people in the colonies in Malaya, Kenya, and Aden, particularly very close to the timeline with Northern Ireland. So by the time these people came to Ireland, they had completely lost their moral compass, and no holds were barred. No holds were barred. Can I just say, I make a bit of a palaver in one of the sections in the ebook where I kind of stress that these guys were secret servants, that they worked in the clandestine world, and that the British government uses things like D notices to cover them up. Now, the reason, and the only reason I put that in, is because I really feel it's unfair to the people of Britain, many of whom I know, have loads and loads of British friends, and they're absolutely fine people. This is all done behind their backs. So criticism of these people is not an endorsement of the IRA. Some idiots try to equate it with. It's not an attack on Britain. It's just these people were criminals operating deep in the shadows, so knowledgeable and aware of what they were doing that they had to cover it up from their own people, who would have been outraged if they'd found out.
Actually, on the note, we'll talk about the events of the actual of the day itself. But on the note about the explosive, which Simpson said was provided them by like proper professionals, the army. The UVF were kind of known. In fact, I spoke to a bomb disposal guy, and he said that the UVF were kind of known as not being as good with their bomb, being competent with their bombs. And it's worth mentioning that all four, I believe, all four bombs detonated that day, went off completely, like flawlessly. They were competent bombs. During the Miami show bomb massacre, a few of them blew themselves up trying to put the bomb in the back of
the static in one of the speakers may have set that off. The McGurk's bombing is good comparison. In the McGurk's bomb, they pulled up outside McGurk's bar, having been waiting outside another bar, which we all believe was the original target. And small kid was down the road and saw the guys get out, and he had the bomb, and it was lit with a fuse. So he drops the bomb, fuse is lighting, the kid way down the road, it's nighttime, he can see it, and then they all run away. So that's the type of sophistication that they had only a year or two or three before this. Now, the bombs on this occasion, there were 3 in Dublin, 1 in Monaghan. They were all in suitcases, and they all had timing devices. A guy called Billy Hanna triggered the timing devices at the Coachman Inn, North Dublin. And if you were to look at a map of Dublin, and if you were to get the areas where these bombs went, and if you were to draw a line down the middle, all the bombs are to one side, if you like, of that line. And this was part of the sophistication. This was identified by Colonel John Morgan of the Irish Army Military Intelligence. He wrote a book about the bombings as well. If you look at this line, these guys were able to park, and then they were able to move to the west, where they would have been picked up. So you have you don't just have sophisticated time-lapse devices, which were not typical, despite what David Irvine and others in the UVF say. They were not sophisticated bomb makers, the UVF. This was highly sophisticated. The maneuver of it, as I've described, the escape route for these guys when they left, quite sophisticated and not typical of the UVF. Does that mean that it's absolutely impossible that they couldn't have done it? Anything is possible, but it was not typical of them, and it was typical of a military mind. And Colonel Morgan really brought that out. And that's his, he sadly passed away now. I knew him well, he was a lovely man. But that's his contribution, I think, or one of his major contributions to it, to identify the military fingerprints in this. A lot of people approach the Dublin bombings from the outsides, and then they try to move in. I think there's enough evidence there now that justifies someone like me simplifying it and laying out what I think happened, starting, if you like, at the center of this. And I've already touched upon the idea of these guys who were blooded in the colonies, and of course the most infamous of them all is Kitson. We've discussed Kitson before at length. And Kitson brought collusion to Ireland. It was standard practice. I quote from the SAS manual in the ebook as well. It was absolutely normal. You go in, you find the enemy's enemy, and you use them, to take out people. Now, in Belfast, we have an inkling of very early 1970s who they were recruiting and who they were using. Albert Ginger Baker was one of them. I have spoken to somebody who actually had his reports in his hand, not Fred Holroyd, not Colin Wallace, another guy altogether, confirmed to me that his code name was Agent Broccoli. So there's absolutely no doubt that Albert Ginger Baker, notorious murderer, he's in the story, was colluding, but he was in Belfast. Now, in rural Armagh, they developed another gang, and it was led by a guy called Billy Hanna, not to be mixed up with Jim Hanna, different guys. Billy Hanna was in his 40s. He was a former British soldier, which made him an ideal candidate for this. And by all accounts, an excellent soldier. He had received all types of gallantry, commendations, awards, that type of thing.
In the Korean War, actually, I was surprised to hear that.
Yeah, Korean War, and I'm by no means an expert on the Korean War, but I know quite a lot of ugly things happened during it. Maybe at some stage, someone who knows about what Hanna did, what his troops did in Korea might come forward. It might be quite innocent. He could have been just fighting on the front lines. So let's not speculate about that. But Hanna was the contact between the Kitson type soldiers. Now, of course, Kitson left Ireland in April of 1972, but he left behind he left behind the blueprint, which was followed. So loads of people, and Joe Tiernan is the absolute expert on this because he's spoken to them. Joe Tiernan, who actually he's the author of this book here, Dublin Bombings, excellent book. He spoke to loads and loads of people. He's written in McGill magazine and Sunday Independent, and he was, of course, the researcher for the massive documentary on Yorkshire television a couple of decades ago. He spoke to loads of these people, and what he discovered was that Hanna was meeting with guys on a very regular basis. They were coming down, they were meeting him, they were taking him out fishing near Banbridge where he lived. But very crucially, there was a kind of a choke point here. You have these British intelligence guys coming down from Belfast or from Lisburn, meeting with Hanna, but nobody else. They were keeping all of Hanna's associates and people pretty much away. Now, loads of the people around Hanna were British agents as well. But for this specific operation and for other operations as well, Hanna was the only one that they communicated with. Now, that's very relevant because guess what happens about a year after the Dublin bombings are done and dusted? Another British agent, the Jackal, comes along and pops his boss, shoots and murders Hanna. The significance of that then is that whilst loads of people may know what was going on in the court of law, it's hearsay. Something they heard said, not direct evidence. So this is a pattern that is becoming increasingly evident when we discover more and more people who were British agents, that once the military intelligence people have got what they want from you, you're eliminated. And yeah, bye-bye. I mean, there's loads of them. John McCaig is another one. Billy Wright, King Rat, another one. And then there's a lot of people who seem to be dying very young from all types of ailments in their 40s. And I'm a little bit suspicious about that. But anyway, Hanna is organizing this bombing in early 1974. Now, that's important because that's before the change of government, before Harold Wilson returns. So when it appears that this thing is starting, Heath, the Tory party, they're still in charge. One of the really crucial things I stumbled across in one of Kitson's books, he wrote many books, was when he was describing an operation he wanted to run in the Oman. And the amount of reviewing by the Ministry of Defense that took place really astonished me. I was astonished at the absolute control within that massive building where they were working. And it indicated to me that these type of counterinsurgency plots and operations are looked at and vetted at a very high level. And it is inconceivable to me that military intelligence officers could possibly have organized an attack on the next door neighbour to London, Dublin, without getting permission from on high. And Heath was very close to some of these intelligence people. There was a committee he had called Gen 42, I think simply because it was in room 42 in Whitehall, in the Cabinet Office or somewhere like that. And he basically gave them a free rein. I don't think he was hands-on about everything. I don't think he knew, and he certainly wasn't getting into the nitty-gritty detail. For God's sake, he was the Prime Minister. He was a very busy man. But he would have, I believe he would have known in broad outline what was going on. And that's what I mean by starting at the center. Starting at the center. This wasn't two or three wild, out of control fellas out there. Now, it is significant that Harold Wilson, who would not have, in my view anyway, would certainly not have countenanced anything like this. He, by a whisker, won the February 1974 general election, and intelligence services' reaction to that was to start plotting against him. And I think that's a very important part of this story. We'll come to it maybe in a moment. But so let's trace back. So you have the power authority in London, you have the Ministry of Defence, and then you have these intelligence officers. You have them following the policies they've developed and the strategies they've developed in the colonies, and you have them now deciding to bomb Dublin. And I believe the two motives for that. I'll come to them in just a moment. And the bombs were executed, and we've already touched upon that. On the day, 3 cars were hijacked in Belfast by Willie Frenchy Marchand and others, and they were then driven down to Portadown, where they were then transported to the Coachman Inn outside Dublin. The Jackal collected the bombs from Glenanne, from Mitchell's farm at Glenanne. There were 3 of them in that suitcase. 3 bombs went to Dublin, and they were, as I described, then dropped around Dublin with the horrible carnage that ensued. And then, as I said as well, then after that, then there was this massive cover-up, ultimately resulting, I believe, in the death of Billy Hannah. So why did they do it? Well, I think David Irvine, who belatedly came to the notion that peace was better than violence, a rather well-known UVF guy, he once said during an interview that from the UVF's perspective, this was a bit like returning the serve. And that's what I've called the ebook, Returning the Serve. In other words, you've put us, you, the people of Ireland, have made our lives miserable. Well, we're going to make your life miserable. It's a very misguided statement. If you look at every single government party, not just in the early 70s, but in the late 70s and the 80s, every single government party, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Labour, and much belatedly the PDs, all of those parties were elected by the Irish public. The overwhelming majority of the Irish public voted for them. And they brought in offences against the state legislation. They financed the police to go after the IRA. They financed operations against the IRA. They spent a fortune on imprisoning the IRA and everything. So I find Irvine's attitude repulsive, disgusting, in fact, that children on the streets of Dublin deserve to be blown up because in his mind, the greater Irish public were somehow supporting the IRA when it's self-evident they weren't. Look at the election results. From the British point of view, before the switch over from Heath to Wilson, I think it was to frighten the Irish people. It was to poison the waters. We've discussed that before. The Kitson idea: if you can't take the fish out with the rod, you poison the water. So if you blow, and did that, there's no doubt that worked. None whatsoever. I mean, the people in the Republic got such a fright and a shock from this. The bombers were in Monaghan as well, of course. That it really, really brought home how violent and ugly it was. It brought home how violent and ugly it was for people living in Northern Ireland on both sides. The community had to put up with this. So I think that was part of the thinking. Another layer of the thinking was a kind of a very, very subtle and undeniable, because they're using the UVF, you see, deniable way of saying to Dublin, make more effort. And if you don't, this type of thing can happen again. And it's a threat, done very, very subtly. And I would not be surprised if behind very, very, very firmly shut doors, heavier hints were given, stating that, look, this is going to happen again. Wouldn't have been done blatantly. It would have been done, well, we're doing our best, but, unless you really get your act together, the David Irvines up here are going to see the Irish people as fair game and we can't stop it. There's a third dimension to it as well. MI5 was run by a guy called Sir Michael Hanley at the time. A big round man. They nicknamed him Jumbo, an awful bully. Anything you ever read about him, he just comes across as a shouting bully, not a pleasant person at all. And he, if you judge a king by his courtiers, he had as his right-hand man probably one of the most evil men in MI5 ever, a guy called Peter Wright. Became very famous in the late 80s for his book Spycatcher, sold millions of it after this volcanic legal battle he had with Thatcher over the publication of the book. And Hanley put Wright in charge of Northern Ireland policy. Now, that's MI5's Northern Ireland policy. In other words, how we're going to deal with things. Now, if you read Spycatcher, you see examples of where Wright, who was a surveillance expert at one stage in his career, was planting bugs and things like that all over the place. He was a sexual blackmailer as a result of this. They tried to blackmail Russian guys they caught in Dublin. So, who was responsible for Kincora? I bet you any money Peter Wright was right behind all of that, because we know now that MI5 was bugging rooms in the Park Avenue Hotel in Belfast, perfectly consistent with the type of things that Wright was doing. Wright's book is very interesting and it's very telling. He describes a horrendous plot against the president of Egypt, which was going to involve releasing sarin gas into it. Now, the sarin gas would have killed Nasser, but also would have killed anybody in the building, anybody around him. If he'd brought his children in that day, cleaning staff, low-level civil servants, high-level civil servants. So it didn't happen, of course, but they planned it and they wrote it. And he has this revolting description of going to Portendown, that nightmare, hellish place. And the fellas come out with their white coats and they have a sheep and they've shaved the sheep and they fired this thing at it. And the poor animal dies in agony. And this was the type of thing that Peter Wright was going down to see. You ask yourself why. So these are the type of things that Peter, and there's a point to this, these are the type of things that Peter Wright is putting in his book. He also describes how he went to Greece, Cyprus during the trouble there with the Greek Cypriots, and he was trying to track down Grievous, the leader of the opposition to Britain. And the purpose of that was so that he could be killed and assassinated. Now, all of this is fine. All of this goes into his book. But there are some things in the book, he says later on, he's so embarrassed about or ashamed of or afraid of that he couldn't put them in the book. And some of those things, he has said this himself, related to Northern Ireland. So what could be, I've outlined there, sarin gas, murder plots against various world leaders, elected democratic ones, other ones were paramilitaries, all of these things. Hideous experiments, etc. But what he did in Ireland was worse than that. Now, what could be worse than all of that? He said there were 10 big secrets he withheld from his book. I suspect one of them. Now, this wasn't just ones he had personally been involved in. This was the wider intelligence community. He said he knew 10 additional things that he didn't put into the book. Kincora has to be one of them. The Dublin bombings of 1972, which guaranteed, or yes, it got the Offences Against the State Act passed, is another one. I suspect the bombing of the boats with the Auschwitz survivors is another one. And absolutely, I mean, if you have to pick the top 10 secrets that he would have known about, the Dublin and Monaghan bombings had to be one of them. Now, what we also know about Peter Wright from his book is that he was at the epicenter of the MI5 plotting, along with others, guys in MI6 and loads of businessmen and others, in the plotting against Harold Wilson. He writes about it himself. Colin Wallace has confirmed it. Harold Wilson himself has spoken about this and written about it before he died. And Wright was such a nutcase that he thought that Hugh Gateskill, who was the leader of the Labour Party, had been murdered by the KGB to put in Harold Wilson, who was a KGB stooge. Now it's not stupid, it's not incompetent, it's not negligent, it's just paranoid gibberish and nonsense. These guys went at one stage and spoke to Hugh Gateskill's doctors and established from the doctors that no, this man's death was unfortunate, but there's nothing at all suspicious here. Peter Wright and the lads just completely put that out of their minds, and no, they convinced themselves that Wilson was a bad guy and had to go. So let's go to February 1974, a few months now before the May 17 bombings of 1974 in Dublin. And you have the plot already in being. You have Billy Hanna meeting with his military intelligence handlers. They're going fishing. They're planning the bombings in Dublin. You then have the change of government, and you have people like Hanley, who was involved in the plotting against Wilson. Peter Wright are now determined to get rid of Harold Wilson. So it's like two rivers meeting. You now have a torrent almost, you have a flood almost. And they decide to topple the power sharing executive that Heath had put in and had. It was one of the most fantastic successes of the early Troubles. You had the Dublin government, SDLP, Alliance, Official Unionist Party, and of course the British government, the Tories, had put together a power sharing government that was working. And Peter Wright and his conspirators saw toppling it as a method of destabilizing the British government and making Harold Wilson look incompetent. And they had an agent. Well, let's just backtrack a little bit. The man in charge of intelligence in Northern Ireland, if you like, the chain of command is, you've got in London, you've got Hanley and Peter Wright and people like that. In Northern Ireland, in Stormont Castle, you had a guy called Dennis Payne. Now, again, you made the point earlier on, I agree with it entirely. Anybody who could involve themselves in the Kincora scandal, they're capable of doing anything, absolutely anything. So you have this hideous creature in Stormont Castle called Dennis Payne, and he's like that with Hanley and Peter Wright and all the rest of it. And MI5 have agents within loyalism who they now start asking to encourage the UDA to start agitating to bring down the power sharing executive. Now, they were pushing an open door. It would have happened without this, but it is telling that this agent, his name was James Miller. He was in Tara at one stage, and then he was in the UDA at a very high level. And Miller came out, gave interviews back in the 80s to Barry Penrose and others, stating that his handlers had asked him to go out at grassroots level and start pushing for this to happen. So the strike then was up and running later on, and there was a leak. Now, what the Ulster Worker Council were doing, these were the strike organisers, UDA, UVF, all the rest of it. What they were doing, they're blocking the roads, they were trying to stop deliveries, they were trying to shut down power stations, they were trying to bring Northern Ireland to a standstill so the government would become redundant and would fall and collapse. And John Hume was in that government, and he was told at one stage that the electricity supply was down to 30%. In other words, give up. It's over. You can't win electricity. 70% of the electricity is gone. And he just refused to believe this. And he was at least one, if not two meetings at which Dennis Payne was at it. And that's just so utterly curious in itself. What the hell? The man in charge of intelligence, who is an MI5 officer, he's in charge of all intelligence in Northern Ireland. What the hell is he doing going to tell the minister that electricity is down? Hume forced a meeting then with the Northern Ireland secretary, and again Dennis Payne turns up and repeats this. So Payne was trying to do this psychological mind games with Hume and the others. So you can see between the plot against Wilson, with Peter Wright, who's in charge of MI5's policy in Northern Ireland, Dennis Payne lying to Hume and the others, James Miller been told to go out and start the strike. And there was also a spy, a traitor, or a source of information who would ring the UWC, the strikers, frequently and tell them that, well, there's going to be roadblocks are going to be put up here and here and here, and the soldiers are going to be sent out to, or so rather, we know that roadblocks are going, you're putting roadblocks up here, there, and everywhere. So the soldiers are going to be going out to try and dismantle them. So they would have advanced knowledge of what was happening. And this was a leak from inside. Has to have been Dennis Payne or Dennis Payne's people. So it's in the third day of this strike that the bombs go off. And the bombs have the effect, of course, of tearing down the power-sharing government. It's gone. Within 3 days, it's gone. It's over. The strike works. The Dublin government is now bereft of a Northern Ireland policy, as indeed is Harold Wilson. Did it achieve its aim insofar as trying to destabilize Harold Wilson is concerned? I think not, because although he'd won the February 74 election by a whisker, there was another election in October 74, and the Tories didn't return. He was Labour Party just about got across the line, and later on, so Lib Dem pact, it's a pact with the Liberals and stuff like that. And they remain in power until 79. So those are the motives for it, and those are the people involved.
I was going to say, to talk to us a little bit about the level of infiltration that the British security forces had in the UVF. The relevance being that if a certain amount were passing information, then it would be impossible to claim that they didn't know on any level about this huge planned attack.
There is a letter from Colin Wallace. I imagine 90% of your viewers know who Colin Wallace was. For the 10% who may not, he was a local Northern Ireland man who was in the British Army. And because of his local knowledge and his natural talent for psychological operations, he very quickly became very central to military psychological operations. Now, as part of his job, he was in receipt of briefings. He was in receipt of what intelligence was coming into Lisburn, where he worked right alongside people in offices, guys from MI5, MI6 military intelligence. There was the secret corridor, make a great title for a book at some stage, I think, the secret corridor, where all these guys worked, including him. Kitson used to come over and visit Wallace from time to time. And by the way, Wallace, a very, very good guy. Wallace could see a million miles when things were getting out of control, and he tried to blow the whistle on Kincora, and he tried to stop assassinations and all of that. So he's a hero of this story. Just because he was mixing with these retrobates, happily it didn't really rub off on him. He was bullied and pressurized into working for them for a year or two, and then kind of pushed back, and then they destroyed his life. I believe you're going to have him on soon, so he'll be able to tell you all about that. But because he had access to all of this intelligence, he knew who inside the UVF were agents. And he wrote a letter in 1975, which I've reproduced in the ebook, and people can read it. And it is irrefutable proof. Nobody, by the way, nobody contests the authenticity of this document at all. And he identifies, when he's writing to one of his colleagues, he identifies, or his former colleague at that stage, he identifies 9 people who were British agents who were implicated in the bombings. Hannah Jackson, the Young brothers, David Mulholland, they're all there. They're all listed in the story. Now, is it conceivable that 25 UVF men could have been, or more, could have been involved in bombing Dublin and Monaghan? And there's at least 9 agents. These are just the ones in Colin's letter. There may have been others, at least 9 agents, and that the RUC, MI5, MI6, military intelligence, UDR, all branches of the British Army, none of them had an inkling of this. It's impossible. That's what they want you to believe. That's what they want me to believe. And they also want to believe that with the benefit of hindsight, there still wasn't any indication that this was coming. It's not that, oh, well, so-and-so did say this to his police handler, but his police handler didn't realize the significance of it. There's none of that. The Gardaí very quickly developed intelligence linking a guy called James Mitchell, Glenanne Farm. That's where the Glenanne gang name comes from. That he was linked to the Monaghan bombing, and there was liaison with the police, with the guards. We went over the border, and they were present for discussions and some questioning as well. And the guards drew up a big long list of people they suspected, but the most significant one is a guy called David Mulholland, David Alexander Mulholland. Mulholland was one of the drivers of the car. He picked up one of the bombs, or he was given one of the bombs, put into a Hillman Avenger, I think it was a green car anyway. Yes, it was a green Hillman Avenger, and he drove it into Dublin. And he must have lost the scout car because they were following a scout car which was provided for them. And he must have lost it because he was going up the one-way streets the wrong way. People were noticing him. When he got out of his car, he drew an awful lot of attention to himself, which is not surprising considering he knew the bomb that was in it and what it was going to do and what it might do to him if it exploded prematurely. And I list them all. Loads of people identified him, and some people were able to go and look at pictures and pick him out of picture books because the guards had pictures of these UDA people, and they picked them all out. So you have Mulholland is the foremost example of the point I'm about to make now. But you also had the guards who'd been across the border discussing things with the RUC, and they were all discussing names and everything. And for some reason, that is inexplicable, has never been explained, despite the Barron inquiry, the McIntyre inquiry, and everything. For some reason, the subcommittee of the Irish government, the cabinet, which had people, Minister for Defence, Minister for Justice, they were not told that the guards had any suspects. Now, how can that be? Why weren't they told about Mulholland? Why weren't they told about the names that they were hearing in from the RUC in Northern Ireland? And of course, as in any conspiracy, there are evil people. There were evil people inside the RUC. Equally, there were very diligent, decent, honest people in the RUC who were trying to get to the bottom of this. And I suspect many of them were the people with whom the guards liaised. And they gave them information, and accurate information too. So there is further research to be done here to find out who was the interface. Now, obviously, it's the two chiefs of intelligence knew what was being told, what was being relayed to the government, and they were Ned Garvey, who very soon in 1975 became Garda Commissioner, and Larry Wren, who was in charge of C3, the epicenter of Garda intelligence. They knew everything that the guards knew. And they're at the most senior level. Now, unless they were dropping files on the way across to the Garda Commissioner who was liaising with the security committee. Well, look, that part is still a bit of a mystery to me, and I suspect there's all types of smoke and mirrors still yet to dismantle there. But somewhere along the line, the guards, having an enormous amount of information, were telling these committee members that they had no suspects. How do we know they had no suspects? Because Don Mullen, who wrote another superb book on the Dublin Monaghan bombings, excellent book. He spoke to them. When he spoke to them, he spoke to the surviving members, and they confirmed that they were told there were no suspects. That's really, I mean, the implications of that are frightening.
Yeah, quite. You might, for anyone who's not quite familiar with kind of how it happened that day, you might give us like a compressed version of like the timelines, like when the bombs went off, the Dublin one, and then.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, the three cars were hijacked by Frenchy Marchand in Belfast and his colleagues on the morning. They were then brought down, eventually brought down to the Coachman's Inn in North Dublin. The Jackal had a chicken van. He delivered chickens, and he picked up the bombs. He drove the van with the 3 bombs and suitcases down to Dublin. They were put in the backs of these cars at the Coachman's Inn. Billy Hanna, the Korean soldier with the Korean experience, flicked on these very sophisticated timing devices. the escort car led them into Dublin, and at about 5:30 on a day when there was a bus strike, people were going really heavily using the trains. They were positioning all of these bombs to go off at the max 5:30 in Dublin at the working day, at the maximum rush hour when people were rushing towards the train stations. They were all very carefully positioned near enough to those channels of pedestrians. My father walked by one of the car bombs half an hour beforehand, could easily have been killed, hence my interest in the story. The bombs then exploded. Now, the guys were making their way, the bombers were making their way back up to Northern Ireland. There were some stories once upon a time that they might have gone down to Wicklow or hiding. No, they are the best research indicates they rushed back to Northern Ireland, and this is where the Monaghan bombings, you see, come into being. 90 minutes after the bombs in Dublin went off, almost simultaneously in a coordinated fashion, 90 minutes later, a bomb went off in Monaghan, killed 7 people. And what it did was it drew the police who were along the border, who might have intercepted the Dublin bombers. It drew all the police to Monaghan to see what was going on there and do their duty and help the citizens and all the rest of it. So consequently, the guys were got up. So I think the Monaghan bombing, that was the purpose of it. That car was hijacked in Portadown that day. It might even have been, I mean, I don't have every single fact in my head, but in the ebook, I think I'm able to give the time from memory, and forgive me if I'm wrong. I think that car was hijacked at about 3:30. So they knew the thing was going ahead. They knew there weren't any hitches. They probably got a telephone call from the phone in the coachman's inn or somewhere like that, or some signal anyway. And they went ahead and they prepared that bomb. Now, the guy who drove that car confessed openly to others that he had done it. Again, another UVF guy. And he spoke to a guy called John Weir. Again, John Weir would be very familiar, I'm sure, to most of your viewers. He was a RUC Special Patrol Group officer. He wasn't involved at this time. He wasn't involved in the Dublin bombings. He was involved in a whole load of other sectarian murders with Robin the Jackal Jackson at a later stage, and he picked up all the stories and all the names. And he's yet another source of it. Again, like I said at the outset, Charlie Simpson's information is new. It's never been published before. It's highly relevant, but it confirms a lot of stuff that Joe Tiernan has found out, Don Mullen has found out, that Weir revealed a long time ago. So the bombs then went off, and I mean there were 280 people injured hideously. There was an unborn child was killed. I have heard stories of police officers and ambulance people having to pick up bodies on the other side of railings where the body was blown through the railings. You can imagine a bomb exploding, metal from the car, shrapnel going through people, shredding them, hitting their bones flat. Now, look, maybe it's better not to describe any of that, because the families, some members of the families, no doubt will be watching this, and let's not go there. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely.
About the...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Something else in the book, which again, Robert Nairac is one of these enduring kind of mysteries of the Troubles, kind of what he was or wasn't involved in, what his actual role was or wasn't. There's some new information in the ebook about Robert Nairac. You might fill us in about.
Yeah. Well, you see, Simpson. Okay, well, Nairac was a Catholic, went to Ampleforth College, the Eton for Catholics in Britain. Frequent visitor to Ireland. People of my vintage remember Lord Killallen, because he was one of the few Irish celebrities when I was growing up on the international stage. He was president of the Olympics and a highly regarded man. And his sons became friendly with Nairac. And by the way, Lord Killallen's a fine man. Just because his sons got to know Nairac, it doesn't say anything about him. He's a grand man. Nairac started coming over to Ireland quite a lot, and he was going down with this family. They're staying, I think, in Dublin and in Spiddal. And he allegedly, I think it's absolute nonsense, allegedly became very fond of the Irish. Actually, it's just BS put out about later on. I think he enjoyed himself in Ireland, but you don't do what he did later on and love the Irish people. Now, what type of a guy was Nairac? Well, was a former British diplomat called Alistair Kerr wrote a book about him called Betrayal, in which he tries to portray Nairac in the most wonderful light, but idiotically gives away so much. Because you see, a lot of Nairac's people were prepared to talk to Kerr because they thought that he was a safe pair of hands. But Kerr, and I quote him verbatim in the book completely. I don't twist it in there, just chunks of what he says. And he's, I'll give one example. He gives an example of having spoken to one of Nairac's colleagues who was told, look, there'll be a patrol tonight, you're going to be on it, it'll be on the border. Nairac's to be stopped and he crosses the border, but the car's not to be searched because there's guns in it. So there we have Mr. Kerr defending the wonderful Robert Nairac by telling us that he went across the border undercover, armed, which was illegal. Now, around about the Falstaff incident, I don't have the date in my head, 1976, I think it might have been, SAS soldiers were stopped and arrested. And another gang then came across the border trying to find them later on. And there were 8 or 9 of them. And then they ended up getting a slap on the wrist and a conviction. Didn't serve any time in prison for, guess what, crossing the border and bringing guns, which is a crime. So thank you very much, Mr. Kerr. You're telling us that your beloved Robert Nairac was a criminal who was crossing the border in disguise, bringing guns. There's loads of stuff as well between Kerr and one or two of Nairac's other biographers, some of whom again wish to portray him very highly. They all indicate that he was up to his neck with the UVF, that he had UVF sources and that he was running UVF sources. One of them tells the story about, it's Kerr actually, story about how there was an interaction with a guy, he doesn't name him, but one of his colleagues, when they were discussing the killing of Green, Francis Green, the IRA commander, who was assassinated at Carville's farm on this side of the border, and to poo-poo the idea that Nairac was there. I agree with them on that, actually. I don't think Nairac was there. But Nairac goes back across the border and Jackson goes back across the border and he has a discussion with Nairac about this. Now, there's a whole big controversy about a photograph and whether Nairac took a photograph and did he give it to Fred Holroyd, a whistleblower, and all the rest of it. So this story has been told against that background. It's trying to poo-poo the fact that Nairac was there. But what the bigger point is missed is, what the hell was Nairac doing talking to Jackson? So there in black and white, you have a man trying to defend Nairac by talking to some of his colleagues, and between the jigs and the reels, it emerges that Nairac knew the jackal. Now, you move on then to the new stuff from Simpson, which makes it absolutely crystal clear that Nairac knew the jackal and that he gave him a gun at one stage, a Browning. I think what Simpson means by that is he gave it to him as a present, and that they were in each other's pockets, and that when what Simpson says is that when Nairac wanted somebody eliminated, he could get the jackal to do it. Now, when Nairac wanted someone eliminated, it wasn't because they'd knocked a pint over him in a pub or something. It was because they were IRA, INLA terrorists and that. So there are quite a few quotes, and I've put them in full. I haven't chopped them up or tried to muck them around or anything like that, and people can read them for themselves, make up their own minds, drawing a connection between Nairac and the jackal, which brings me back to, I think, where we started in 1975. The jackal, who we now know is a British agent, we now know is connected to Nairac, kills Billy Hanna. And that begs the question why. One answer of which is, well, like I said, it shut down direct first-hand knowledge of British involvement in the Dublin bombings. After that, it's hearsay. There's lots more about Nairac. I mean, Nairac seems to be very unpleasant gentleman. We would go around London in his spare time picking fights with people, beating up taxi drivers. That's not the act of a hero. He he was into blood sports and everything. I know hundreds of thousands of people are into blood sports, but you know, taking pleasure in ripping animals apart, it's kind of consistent with the type of area he found himself in as well. One of Nairac's school teachers said that he was always trying to prove himself. And you know, that's great if you're a footballer or a runner or something like that. But if you're jumping into the dirty war and you're mixing with counterinsurgency people and involved in collusion, and you're in your early 20s, remember, this guy was 22, 23, 24, and you're dying to prove yourself with all this macho stuff. It's terrible. Sorry, there was another new thing. This doesn't come from Simpson at all, it comes from somewhere else. That I'm pretty sure it's new. I don't think I've seen it anywhere else. And anyway, I got it from an independent source. The IRA knew full well what Nairac was and who he was. Now, come back. If I drift off, John, bring me back. Put a bit of discipline on me. We'll come back to what the IRA knew about Nairac in a minute. But what was Nairac? What was Nairac? Now, Nairac did 4 tours of duty in Ireland, and the first one fairly innocuous. Really, he was a normal soldier in Belfast. Then he went off and he did some special training in Kenya, home of the Mau Mau and Kitson and all of that. So I suspect maybe he got a bit of special training there. He would certainly appear to have gotten special training as well from the SAS, though he was never in the SAS. And he was sent back, and by early 1974, he rocks up at this place called Castledillon, which was the home of the 14th Intelligence Division. This was the Dirty Tricks Brigade in rural Northern Ireland. And it wasn't part of the normal military chain of command. It was controlled by MI5, by Stormont, by Dennis Payne, and people like that. And ostensibly, and what the British state has been prepared to kind of acknowledge is, yes, Nairac had some type of an intelligence role, and he was liaison between the RUC Special Branch and the SAS, and all of that's true. But there was a deeper level to it too, and the deeper level was he was carrying out assassinations. He was getting rid of people like Green and people like that. So that's what he was. That's what he was. Now, the provost knew this, and the provost had him under surveillance. And they were playing a long game, a waiting game. They were watching him. They knew exactly who he was. They knew where he was based. And when he would go into pubs, they were watching who he would meet. So when he went to the 3 steps where he met his end, that wasn't these more sophisticated, higher level provisional IRA people. The local Republicans got their hands on him, and it span out of control, and he died. Now, a friend of mine who's read the piece asked me a very interesting question I've been puzzling over in my head as well. Why didn't the intelligence people who were watching him intervene? Well, I don't know who the intelligence people in the IRA, I haven't been given their names. I don't know who they were. I mean, it could have been anybody. It could have been a lounge person, could have been woman behind the bar, and she's watching. You know, IRA were quite sophisticated in their intelligence gathering. So maybe over time that part of the story, which has been suppressed by everybody for a long time, may come out. And then I think it's well known what happened in Nairac after that. Well, it's well known he was taken away, beat very badly. Man pretended to be a priest, offered to hear his confession. He did not fall for that. They killed him, and his body has never been found.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, he's one of these kind of enigmas. A lot of things. I'm sure, fairness, I'm sure there's things that maybe he didn't do that gets hung on his hook, just given that we know.
Of course,
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we'll wrap it up. We'll wrap it up like soon enough. I wanted to ask you, I like growing up, obviously I'm not from Dublin or Monaghan or surrounding county, but I'm fairly certain I didn't hear about the Dublin and Monaghan bombings until I was like in my later teens. Like you would really think it's the type of thing that has a very a well publicized kind of anniversary and commemoration. So maybe it's just me, just kind of anecdotally, but like I don't remember once hearing about it in school or on telly. I mightn't have been paying attention. Is that something you feel yourself? Is it something that feels like it's kind of
Well, yeah, sure,
underreported or under commemorated?
sure. Yeah, well, I remember going to I think it was about 1992 or 1993. I went to a meeting in Boswell's Hotel, and I remember coming out, and the place was surrounded by special branch fellas in cars. Very intimidating, and there was a bit of an altercation. Now, think about that for a moment. These are the victims of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings and the 72 bombing. Some of the people were there, maybe others as well, other victims. And the branch are outside watching them as if they're criminals. I mean, that's just disgusting. Now, there were good people higher up in the guards at this stage. Wren, who I have no time for, Wren was gone, and other good people had come in, and I don't actually blame them because, and I'll come to the reason for that in a moment. They, at a higher level, there were certainly some serious efforts by the guards to try and belatedly see if they could solve the crime, early 90s. But these branch guys here, I mean, the files, hopefully, of the surveillance of the Dublin Monaghan campaigners should still be around, and the names of the people in the car and who ordered them to be there, and were they entitled to be there, and should they have been there, and did they have the approval of their bosses? So yeah, first, so you had that type of intimidation, and that contained, I think, that a campaign that maybe might have taken off a bit more after the famous Yorkshire documentary. The link is in my story. You can get it on YouTube, and there's an excellent one 2 years later by RT. Again, link is in there. That's the first part of it. Second part of it was, and I know what I'm talking about because I grew up in South County Dublin. And I'm going to say it because nobody else will. These were working class people. If that bomb had gone off, the bridge club in the RDS, where my mother played bridge, right? Or it had gone off in a golf club, or it had gone off in Lansdowne Road.
Or Balls Bridge.
Yeah. But it's exactly like the Stardust thing. Now, Irish people would be familiar with that. Maybe some of your viewers in America might not be, but that was the horrendous fire around 1981. Sorry, not around, right, in 1981. And again, ignored, treated badly, didn't get justice until very recently. Again, why? If that fire again had been in any of the locations I've spoken about, it'd be a whole different thing. So I think I'm sorry, I think that's a part of it. And I grew up going around South County Dublin, and the most fashionable thing you could say was, "Oh, Northern Ireland, wouldn't it be great? Dig a moat around it, fill it with water, or dig a moat around it and push it out to sea." You know, uh, these are the type of some of them are the type of people who the height of their life would have been if they'd been invited for a stale cucumber sandwich in the British Embassy. So I think that's part of it as well. And another huge part of it is the influence of the Workers' Party in the Irish Times and in RTE. There's no doubt about that, none whatsoever. I mean, Dick Walsh was the political correspondent of the Irish Times. They still have a statue of him in the lobby of the place for decades, and he was speechwriter for Cathal Goulding, chief of staff of the official IRA. It's well known that Dick Walsh, of all places, I think it was a mortuary, there was turned up at a conference which took place in a funeral home or a mortuary, something like that. Daithí O'Connell was there. It was during one of the feuds, and Walsh was there to represent the Workers' Party. Now, I'm not saying the Workers' Party were involved in the Dublin bombings. No, absolutely not. But they would have seen any criticism of the British state as being tantamount to giving succor to the IRA, which it's not. That's childish, immature thinking and has to be quashed. So I think anything that would have been critical, anything that would have pointed a finger at the British Secret Service was just something that the likes of Dick Walsh and that just did not want to have anything to do. And Dick Walsh was he wasn't the only one in the Irish Times or in the media who had those thoughts. So you combine those, and God knows how much more. You combine all of that, and it was buried. But then you got Justice for the Forgotten campaign came along, and Margaret Irwin and people like that doing and continuing to do marvelous work. There's a new documentary, marvelous documentary out now. And I don't think at this stage we're ever going to, no one's going to go behind bars. They're all dead now. But I think we can safely say that this was organized at the highest level, certainly within MI5 and the Department of Ministry of Defence in Britain. Hanley would have been aware of it. Dennis Payne would have overseen it. Peter Wright would have been up to his neck in it. They used the military intelligence people. They used their surrogates, their proxy assassins. Hannah and his wider control of people. They helped them. They bombed Dublin. They did it for the reasons I've explained, and they've covered it up. And yes, the Irish media, particularly the Irish Times and RT, could have done more. Now, we have to give full marks though to Primetime, who did the 1995 documentary. But aside from that, could have done an awful lot more, in my view. An awful lot more. Now they're trying to make it up, and then there'll be all types of coverage and everything. But at the time when they could have thrown their resources at it 20, 30, 40 years ago, they didn't. For them to explain why, I'm throwing out what they'll find undoubtedly quite insulting remarks, but
Sure.
they're big boys, they can answer back.
Of course. Give me 1 second. I'll do my computer. I got one more question too.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Oh, right. Okay, very good. Okay, so I didn't notice before you mentioned it, but thank God your father had a very lucky escape. You said he was about 30 minutes. You know, if he passed that 30 minutes later, he wouldn't have been arrested. Can you talk to me a little bit? Because I guess that this makes it a more personal journey of finding out what happened and all. Can you talk to me a little bit about your own just your own kind of journey through this? Because I know, I mean, I saw in the ebook even in like 1990 you were writing about it.
Yeah, well, there was a story in a magazine now defunct called Now magazine. I think it was designed to be halfway between the Phoenix and McGill. It lasted for about a year and a half, and I was involved a little bit with that before my career elsewhere took off. But in 1990, I did a story, and you see, at that stage, Peter Wright had come out, and I was able to put together all of the bits and pieces indicating the MI5. Sorry, I'll start again. Indicating the extension of the anti-Wilson plot to the tearing down of Stormont. And at this time as well, you had Colin Wallace was coming forward. You had Fred Holroyd, a military intelligence officer who was working in the Portadown area and who was aware that the Jackal was a British agent. You know, all of this was coming forward, and it made sense to me at that stage that that the bombings weren't merely a return of the serve, as David Irvine so horribly said, but that there was a kind of a political dimension to it as well. And then Peter Wright in the trial, and has 10 secrets about Ireland. So that kind of intrigued me. And so a 4 or 5 page story was produced with lots of new information. Colonel Morgan contributed to it, and nothing. Except at some later stage, some person still unknown to me, though Colonel Morgan writes about him in his book, was doing a little bit of research in the library, and somebody handed a copy of this magazine to this person. The person was involved with Yorkshire Television, I think, then got Colonel Morgan's name and spoke to Colonel Morgan, and then that led to the famous Yorkshire Television documentary and the sterling work done by Joe Tiernan for that. And so, although the story, and you're asking me about my contribution to my story, fell flat on the ground and nobody paid a tinker's curse of attention to it, nonetheless, that little thread was picked up. So some good did come of it. And then you had the wonderful campaign by Justice for the Forgotten. You had the documentaries. You had Don Mullen's book. You had Joe Tiernan eventually produced a book in the Barron Inquiries. and so on and so forth, and that and various other things. I outline them very briefly in the ebook, and it brings us right up to date. And this little bit of new information, thanks to Chris Moore, he gave to me about Charlie Simpson, which is now out there, which confirms and gives a little bit more detail about what was going on. So at the end of the day, at the end of this journey, I think it's blatantly obvious what happened, but they got away with it.
I see. Thank you so much now for everything you've shared. As always, I appreciate it.
Can I just jump in? There is one thing one
of
very
course,
important thing I forgot.
we're
I mentioned
not
the
completely.
guards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ned Doherty, when Wren went, when Wren went in November of 1987 as Garda commissioner, Finn Fáil were back in power, just back in power, and Haughey appointed his old pal Ned Doherty as Garda commissioner. Now, Ned Doherty was one of the guards who investigated, tried to get to the bottom of the Dublin bombings. Ned Doherty was involved in the inquiries, and now he was Garda commissioner, and he was followed on by 2 or 3 rather excellent Garda commissioners. And at some stage, dates are a little bit hazy for me yet. A very concerted and serious operation was launched with dedicated special branch officers were assigned to the border, and they were watching because they hoped that James Mitchell, the owner of Glenann Farm, who's still alive back in this is the early 90s, that he might stumble across the border one day and they were going to nab him. And I'm not too sure about the duration of it. It's something between 3 and 6 months. They had officers up there. Now, I don't know, were they in dugouts or were they sitting in cars, but they were waiting. And Mitchell, who did cross the border during that period of 6 months, amazingly didn't. Was he tipped off? Anyway, who knows? He didn't come across the border. Had he come across the border, he would have been arrested, and he would have been the guards have information about his links to Monaghan bombing, or so they believed. God knows what would have happened. And that I won't go into it today, but that opens up a whole other chasm. There were 3 factions within the guards. There were just ordinary guards just going in the intelligence world. Now there were guards who were cooperating. I don't mean treacherously. I'm just cooperating, quasi-legitimately, maybe illegitimately at times, to legitimately at times. But they were very much cooperating with British intelligence. Then there was a faction who felt that, look, we don't want to have anything to do with these guys that bomb Dublin, etc. We want to try and see if we can catch guys like Mitchell. So you had the very loosely, the pro-British faction, you had the anti-British intelligence faction, and then you had just guards who weren't kind of involved, just going and doing their job. So for a brief moment, there was a very concerted effort to try and crack the story. The guards knew exactly who did it, and God knows what might have happened, like I said, if they'd gotten Mitchell, but they didn't.
Very good.
Some new information in the ebook, never produced before.
Very good, very good. I was going to say the link for the ebook is in the podcast and the YouTube. Yeah. I'd advise anyone who's listened this far. There's way more detail than we went into here. Well worth reading. Anything now that you maybe wanted to mention we didn't get a chance, or just kind of anything any parting?
Just the guards there. You gave me the chance, so I think I've mentioned it. People should watch out for the new documentary on it. Maybe we can arrange to put a link to the publicity for it now, because it's going to be shown in the Lighthouse and 1 or 2 other places around the place. But I'm sure at some stage it'll get a showing in America, and maybe it might be put up on a website or something. So just to let people know, there's a new documentary. Lots of interviews with the members of the family, which I think very, 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 very important. People can see the suffering that these people went through for now 50 years, and the bad way they were treated for now 50 years as well. So if I could just mention that from the point of view of awareness, be great.
Very good. Thank you very much. Now everything you shared, very interesting. We're obviously commemorating a terribly tragic event, and I think it's important. I think doing the victims the justice of bringing as much information as is out there out to the public. I think that's important for them. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity, and It's much appreciated, and the very, very best of luck with the website as ever.
Simon, thanks very much, boy. We'll speak again soon.